Welcome to our discussion of Congress, the first of the three branches of government we're going to talk about. As I call it, the L bubble, out of the L, E, and J bubbles. Congress is big and sometimes hard to understand. So here are two main organizational principles we will follow to understand why anybody does what they do, what motivates these 100 senators and 400 some odd congressmen to do what it is they do. We've got 500 some odd people running around making legislation. What motivates them? Well, in the first case, it's political parties. The Democrats and Republicans dominate our governmental system, and so the concerns of your party are part of what motivates you as a congressperson. And we have committees, which is how we organize the discussion of potential legislation, and that's really where all the work gets done behind the scenes. When you tune into C-SPAN and look at Congress, you're not going to see many people on the floor because all the work is really done behind the scenes in committees. So we have these two competing principles at work. We've got the party stuff, which makes legislators act in strategic manner and figure out how they can get their party in the majority, and committees where actual work gets done. A typical congressperson sits on 5 committees and subcommittees, and it's really important to that congressperson to get on a committee that has something to do with their district. If they're from Louisiana, they better get on the shrimping committee or something having to do with their local economy to show their district that they can get stuff done that matters to their lives. A senator sits on about 13, so that's a little bit more general. They spread it around a little bit more because there's fewer of them. So we typically call congresspeople policy specialists and senators policy generalists. Here's what Congress does. I've got some apes to illustrate it. Congress passes bills. We call that authorization. This is basically the lawmaking function. Technically, a bill is not a law until the president signs it, so even though Congress is our lawmaking body, it passes bills more than making laws, technically. Congress is also in charge of the purse, of appropriating funds, getting money and deciding where to spend it. We tax citizens and we decide the budget for each executive branch agency. And Congress is also in charge of making sure that other side in the E-bubble, the bureaucracy, is doing the right thing. Congress makes the laws, but it's up to the executive branch to execute them. So Congress once in a while has to make sure that the executive branches, like the EPA, are following through with whatever law the Congress made, like a Clean Air Act, and making sure that they're fulfilling the law and executing it in the way they meant. And they have some power over the bureaucracy because of the second one, because they appropriate the funds and determine the budgets. So over here on the right you see my apes thinking about it. Okay, I'll make the law, then spending stuff. Look, I have money. And then this one at the bottom here, what are you doing with the law I made? That's the oversight ape. Let's talk a little bit more about this committee system. Nothing in the Constitution about them, but they cropped up pretty soon because it's pretty hard to organize our legislative branch without committees. There's too many people. So to figure out what might be good ideas for laws, to discuss and research laws, we split it up in these subgroups called committees. The party in charge, Democrat or Republican, gets to decide who's on what committee for their party. And if the Democrats are in control 60%, the Democrats also have 60% of every committee. Leadership in the House is a lot more formal in that the Speaker of the House, which is what we call the leader of the majority party in the House, gets to decide a lot more than the standing member of the Senate. The Speaker of the House has a lot of power. They also get to decide what committee bills go to. We call that the power of agenda setting, and that can be pretty interesting. If you're a speaker and don't want a bill to make it to the floor, you might send it to a committee where you know it will never make it out of there. So ideas for bills are sent to committees, and if they make it out of committee and come to the floor, we call that being reported out of committee to the floor where they can actually get voted on. The committee system is where all the substantive work happens. This bullet here about Congress on exhibition is from a quote from Woodrow Wilson, where he says Congress on the floor is basically a show, an exhibition, whereas Congress in the committee, that's where all the work's happening. You'll notice that our two houses, the House and Senate, sit in a half circle in an arc format and address the president of the chamber at the time. That's in contrast to the British House and the British model, where they sit up opposite each other and basically yell at each other. So we were attempting to be less confrontational. This is a YouTube link to just an example of the British House yelling and arguing at each other. It takes a lot of voting for something to make its way to be a law. This YouTube link is to a classic I'm Just a Bill Schoolhouse Rock video. But essentially, a bill, a potential law, has to be voted out of committee to the floor, and then debated on the floor and voted on the floor, the main chamber, to be passed. And that's not the end of it, because we have two houses. We have the Senate and the House. And a bill has to be passed in both of those chambers in identical form for it to be sent to the president. So a lot of times what happens is a bill will pass the House, but in the exact language it will not pass the Senate. And in that case, the bill goes to something called a joint committee, where members of the House and Senate meet and try to hash out language to make the law uniform, the bill uniform, and then it goes back to the floors to be voted on again. In any case, there are a series of decisions being made, and it's very possible that you, as a member of the legislative branch, would vote for something 3 times and against it 3 times, depending on how it changes at each step. That makes it really hard for members of the legislative branch to run for president later, because it makes them look wishy-washy. See John Kerry's attempt at becoming president most recently. It's very hard for somebody from the L bubble, the legislative branch, to try to become president because of the number of votes that happen. One really important committee for the House is the Rules Committee, that decides how long a bill will be debated and if they will allow certain amendments. The Senate does not have a Rules Committee, and there's no limit on the amount of time to be debated. That's why the Senate has the filibuster, where somebody can stand up and talk as long as they can. The most famous, probably Strom Thurmond, filibustering the Civil Rights Act. He just started reading from a phone book. He was up for 20 hours or so. There are 2 different kinds of representation happening in these 2 different houses. The Senate has more of a trustee model. The trustee model says, I told you what I stand for. You elect me for 6 years. I'm going to go make decisions for a while. The House runs on more of a delegate model, which is translating the will of the people. Members of the House have to much more regularly go back to their constituents and see what public opinion looks like, because they're elected every 2 years. So they're basically running for re-election just about right after they get elected. There are many conflicting expectations of Congress. It is essentially designed to be slow and deliberate. The founders were very worried about the power of majority rule and democracy making too many laws, so they designed a system to be very slow. Americans love the Constitution, but they hate Congress. And part of that hate of Congress is that they don't get much done. But Congress is constitutionally defined not to get much done. It's one of these paradoxes of American politics, that Americans love the Constitution, but then come to despise the institution that does exactly what the Constitution asks of it. And so we have people have very low opinions of Congress, but on the other hand, people love their congressperson. Another paradox. We hear people all the time complain about Congress, but if you ask them about their congressperson, they go, oh, I love my congressperson. He or she is not the problem, it's the rest of Congress. And that is an obvious paradox. If people voted different people into Congress, perhaps Congress would behave differently. That relates to the issue of party responsibility. Party responsibility means, does your party all vote together all the time? If we had responsible parties, we would get a lot more legislation passed, because whoever got the majority would just steamroll through laws. But we do not have responsible parties because we have a very candidate-centered electoral system. If I stand up in front of my district and say, I do whatever the party wants, no one's going to vote for me. If I stand up and I say, I'm my own man and I stand up for us, and sometimes I vote this way, sometimes I vote the other way, I'm much more likely to be elected. Of course, a whole Congress of people making up their own mind is a little more chaotic, it's less responsible, and therefore gets less done. We know that we have a bicameral legislature, meaning a House and a Senate, 2 houses, bicameral. That can be good and bad. We get some interesting kinds of representation because of it, but it does slow things down. I mentioned filibusters a while ago. Nowadays, it's really the threat of a filibuster is just as important as a filibuster, though you can overcome a filibuster with a cloture, a motion of cloture, which takes 60 votes. Become familiar with who the current Speaker of the House is, who the current Majority Leader is. That's important. It's also kind of important you know who the representatives from your district and your state are. Basic political knowledge you should gain. Concept of political pork is, can you as a congressperson bring back federal dollars to your district? Can you score a bridge project? Can you score money? And that money we call pork. And we know that congresspeople are up there every day trying to get money for their own district. And in many ways, this is how justice is hashed out in our legislative branch. People arguing about who deserves what and who deserves what when and how much. We live in an area that is commonly divided. We call it divided government, meaning one party controls the president and one party controls Congress. Or vice versa. We call that divided government, and since about 1980 that seems to be true more often than not. Americans will vote in a Republican as president, but then they'll vote Democrats into Congress, or they'll vote Republicans in the Congress but vote for a Democrat for president. That obviously has repercussions. It slows things down, but apparently Americans like that moderation, or are just simply so short-sighted that they'll just bounce back and forth, never getting all one or the other. A really important piece of the story in our current very partisan Washington is redistricting. We do this every 10 years to adjust for population. And the party in charge of the state legislature in different states is in charge of how you redraw district lines to make sure every district has the same number of people. They obviously have political motivations, and so over time, districts have become safer and safer, meaning it's more and more obvious that whoever the Republican is going to win this district, and in some other district, whoever the Democrat is going to win that district. And that allows for our politicians to become more and more ideologically extreme because they're going to win their district. They don't have to be moderate and try to appeal to both moderates and partisans. And this is a big piece of the story of why there's such a partisan divide in our nation's capital. Go ahead and check out this website, www.redistrictinggame.org. I could go on a little further about redistricting, but this website does an excellent job teaching you about how the different strategies of redistricting can affect our politics overall. So go play a couple rounds on this to complete the assignment for this week. Some of the future issues we think about with Congress. Should we put some limits on how many terms a congressperson can serve? We currently do not have any limits. You know that we have a 2-term limit on the president. That wasn't until FDR won his 4th term, and the Republicans were like, all right, let's do something about this. But we currently have no limit on how many times you can be reelected to be in the Senate or the House. Being able to be reelected a lot gives you seniority, helps you understand what's going on. It's more likely you're more effective. On the other hand, maybe it'd be nice if we rotated in new people every once in a while. There really has been a shifting of power from the L bubble to the E bubble, from the Congress to the President, and that's a big piece of the story of Congress overall.